The 14th of May, 1945. Prisoner collection point, near Pisa, Italy. The dust in the holding pen tasted of iron and exhaust fumes. Hildegard pressed her back against the sun-baked wire fence, her knuckles white as she gripped the shoulders of Greta, a 19-year-old auxiliary who was trembling violently. The rumors had outpaced the Allied tanks. The Schwarze, blacks, were coming, the monsters from Dr. Goebbels' posters, depicted as jazz-crazed savages with no concept of mercy. A convoy of deuce-and-a-half trucks roared to a halt, kicking up a fresh cloud of Tuscan dust. The engines cut, leaving a ringing silence that was heavier than the noise. Hildegard reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against her piece of rough, gritty Riff soap, her last anchor to a civilized routine. If they touch us, she thought, her breath hitching, I will scream until my throat bleeds. The driver's door of the lead truck opened. A boot hit the dirt. Then, a man stepped out. He was tall, his skin the color of deep mahogany, contrasting sharply with his olive-drab uniform. He wore the insignia of a staff sergeant on his sleeve. He did not howl. He did not lunge. He adjusted his cap, walked to the rear of the truck, and began unloading crates of rations with a rhythmic, practiced efficiency. He caught Hildegard staring. The air curdled with tension. Greta whimpered. The sergeant paused. He looked at the terrified women, then at the heavy crate in his hands. He didn't smile, but his eyes were tired, lacking the malice she had been promised. Steady now, the sergeant said, his voice a deep rumble that carried over the wind. Nobody's gonna hurt you here, ma'am. He set the crate down near the fence line, not thrown, but placed. On the side, a hand-painted sign read, Authorized personnel. Only. Keep gate clear. Hildegard didn't understand the English, but she understood the posture. It wasn't the stance of a beast. It was the stance of a weary man doing a job. If you enjoy historical stories from the other side of the wire, please consider subscribing and let us know which country you are watching from. 3 weeks earlier, the 2nd of May, 1945. Somewhere in the Bavarian Alps, near the Austrian border, the war did not end with a bang for Hildegard, but with the smell of burning paper. Inside the commandeered farmhouse that served as the temporary headquarters for the Wehrmacht Signals Auxiliary Unit, the air was thick with smoke. It wasn't the acrid, oily smoke of combat, but the dry, choking ash of bureaucracy being erased. Hildegard stood by the cast-iron stove, feeding it handfuls of logbooks and frequency charts. Her hands, usually steady on a telegraph key, were trembling. They are less than 5 kilometers away, Oberhelferin, Greta whispered. The 19-year-old girl was clutching a canvas rucksack to her chest as if it contained gold. It contained only socks and a framed photo of her mother. Keep feeding the fire, Greta, Hildegard said, her voice sharp, cutting through the panic rising in the room. We leave nothing legible. That is the order. Orders. The word tasted like ash. The Führer was dead. Berlin had fallen. The orders were ghost signals from a corpse. Yet Hildegard clung to them, because the alternative was to think about what came next. She reached into the pocket of her gray wool uniform jacket. Her fingers curled around the familiar, rectangular shape of her Riff soap. It was a dense, gritty block, made more of sand and filler than fat, leaving the skin raw and red after every wash. But it was hers. It was German. It was the last tangible piece of a structure that was dissolving around her. Outside, the roar of engines grew louder. A deep, mechanical grinding that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of German trucks. It was the heavy, throaty growl of American machinery. God in heaven, another auxiliary, Martha sobbed from the window. Hildegard abandoned the stove and moved to the window, peering through the lace curtains. A column of olive-drab vehicles, marked with the white star of the invaders, was snake-winding up the Alpine road. Remember what we were told, Hildegard said, turning back to the 6 terrified women in the room. She felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, a nausea born of years of relentless propaganda. The radio broadcasts had been clear. The Americans were bad, but their auxiliary troops, the colonial forces, the colored soldiers were beasts let loose by Roosevelt to terrorize European women. "Fix your uniforms," Hildegard commanded, buttoning her jacket to the throat. "Stand straight. Do not look them in the eye. We are soldiers of the Reich, not cattle." It was a lie. They were no longer soldiers. They were spoils of war. The front door of the farmhouse was kicked open downstairs. Heavy boots thundered on the wooden stairs. Hildegard gripped the Riff soap so hard its sharp edges dug into her palm. She stepped in front of Greta, shielding the girl with her body. The door to their room swung open. Framed in the doorway were men in helmets covered with netting. They held rifles loosely but ready. But it was not the weapons that made Greta scream a short, stifled sound. It was the men. They were not the blonde, blue-eyed archetype of the Aryan hero, nor were they the white Americans Hildegard had seen in newsreels. Their skin was dark, ranging from the color of oak to deep onyx. One of them, a corporal with dust coating his dark cheeks, stepped forward. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the terrified women, the burning stove, and finally, on Hildegard. He didn't snarl. He didn't lunge. He shifted his gum to the other side of his cheek and pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "Raus," he said. His voice was flat, indifferent. Outside. Schnell. Hildegard didn't move immediately. She was paralyzed by the sheer physical reality of the enemy she had been taught to fear above all else. "Let's go, Fräulein," the soldier added, his tone dropping an octave, not in anger, but in exhaustion. Hildegard nodded once, stiffly. She took Greta's arm. As she walked past the soldier, she held her breath, expecting a grab, a strike, a violation. But the soldier simply stepped back to let them pass, his gaze already moving to the next room, searching for weapons, indifferent to their fear. They were herded out into the bright alpine sunlight, where the true scale of their defeat waited on the backs of waiting trucks. The journey was measured not in miles, but in the bruising rhythm of the suspension. For hours, the deuce and a half truck had been eating up the Italian countryside, lurching over shell-cratered roads that threw the women against one another like sacks of grain. The canvas cover overhead trapped the heat and the smell, a suffocating cocktail of unwashed wool, diesel fumes, and the sour tang of fear. Hildegard sat near the tailgate, her legs cramping in the limited space. Beside her, Greta had finally stopped weeping and had lapsed into a catatonic silence, her head resting heavily on Hildegard's shoulder. Every time the truck hit a pothole, Greta's small frame shuddered, and Hildegard tightened her arm around the girl's waist, an instinctive barrier against the chaos. "They are taking us to Africa," a woman whispered from the darkness of the truck bed. It was Frau Muller, an older typist whose bun had unraveled into gray wisps. "I heard the drivers talking. They will sell us in the markets there." "Be quiet, Muller," Hildegard snapped, though she kept her voice low. "They are taking us to a collection point. That is standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" Muller hissed back, her eyes wide and manic in the gloom. "Look at who is driving us. You saw them. The Schwarz. Do you think they follow standard procedure?" Berlin said, "They are savages." Berlin said, "Berlin is burning." Hildegard cut her off, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "And we are still alive. Focus on that." She reached into her pocket again, needing the tactile reassurance. Her fingers found the Riff soap. The rough, sandy texture scraped against her thumb. It was a miserable object, barely capable of creating a lather. But it was solid. It was real. Unlike the monsters in Muller's imagination, the soap was something she could control. It reminded her of cold mornings in the barracks, of order, of a time when the world made sense. The truck began to slow, the gears grinding down with a mechanical groan. The sudden deceleration threw everyone forward. The murmur of panic rose instantly. "We are stopping," Greta whispered, lifting her head, her eyes darting around. "Why are we stopping? Are we there?" Hildegard didn't answer. She peered through the gap in the canvas, flaps at the rear. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across a landscape of flattened vineyards and ruined farmhouses. The convoy had pulled onto a wide dirt shoulder. Boots crunched on gravel. The voices of the American drivers drifted back deep, rhythmic, shouting to one another in a slang-heavy English she could barely parse. She tensed, expecting the canvas to be ripped open, expecting violence. Instead, a canteen was thrust through the gap in the flap. "Water," a voice said from outside. Not a command, just a statement. Hildegard stared at the aluminum flask dangling in the opening. A dark hand held it. The fingers were calloused, the nails trimmed short and clean. No one moved to take it. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind images of jazz-crazed demons. "Take it," Hildegard whispered to the woman nearest the flap. "It might be poison," Muller whimpered. "If they wanted to kill us, they would use bullets." "It is cheaper," Hildegard said pragmatically. She reached over, took the canteen, and unscrewed the cap. She took a small sip first. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was sweet relief. She passed it to Greta. The truck engine roared back to life, cutting short the brief respite. The canteen was snatched back, the flap fell shut, and they were moving again. But the dynamic in the dark truck bed had shifted. The water hadn't been poison. Night fell, turning the interior into a pitch-black tomb. Hours later, the motion changed. The bouncing stopped, replaced by the smooth hum of asphalt, then the slow crunch of gravel. Lights harsh, electric floodlights cut through the canvas gaps, slicing across the women's faces. The truck stopped for good. The engine died. "Everybody out," a voice boomed. Hildegard stood up on stiff legs, helping Greta to her feet. She patted her pocket one last time, ensuring the Riff soap was safe. She stepped toward the tailgate, blinking as the canvas was thrown back. They had arrived at the wire. The air here was different, saltier, warmer. They were near the sea. Pisa. As Hildegard jumped down from the truck, her boots sinking into the dust, she looked up. Towering above them, illuminated by the searchlights, were the guard towers. And patrolling the perimeter, walking with a casual but imposing gait, were the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division. Dozens of them. The rumors were true. They had been delivered into the hands of the other. The journey was measured not in miles, but in the bruising rhythm of the suspension. For hours, the deuce-and-a-half truck had been eating up the Italian countryside, lurching over shell-cratered roads that threw the women against one another like sacks of grain. The canvas cover overhead trapped the heat and the smell, a suffocating cocktail of unwashed wool, diesel fumes, and the sour tang of fear. Hildegard sat near the tailgate, her legs cramping in the limited space. Beside her, Greta had finally stopped weeping and had lapsed into a catatonic silence, her head resting heavily on Hildegard's shoulder. Every time the truck hit a pothole, Greta's small frame shuddered, and Hildegard tightened her arm around the girl's waist, an instinctive barrier against the chaos. "They are taking us to Africa," a woman whispered from the darkness of the truck bed. It was Frau Müller, an older typist whose bun had unraveled into gray wisps. "I heard the drivers talking. They will sell us in the markets there." "Be quiet, Müller," Hildegard snapped, though she kept her voice low. "They are taking us to a collection point. That is standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" Müller hissed back, her eyes wide and manic in the gloom. "Look at who is driving us. You saw them. The Schwards. Do you think they follow standard procedure? Berlin said they are savages. Berlin said, Berlin is burning." Hildegard cut her off. the words tasting like ash in her mouth. And we are still alive. Focus on that. She reached into her pocket again, needing the tactile reassurance. Her fingers found the Riff soap. The rough, sandy texture scraped against her thumb. It was a miserable object, barely capable of creating a lather, but it was solid. It was real. Unlike the monsters in Muller's imagination, the soap was something she could control. It reminded her of cold mornings in the barracks, of order, of a time when the world made sense. The truck began to slow, the gears grinding down with a mechanical groan. The sudden deceleration threw everyone forward. The murmur of panic rose instantly. "We are stopping," Greta whispered, lifting her head, her eyes darting around. "Why are we stopping? Are we there?" Hildegard didn't answer. She peered through the gap in the canvas flaps at the rear. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across a landscape of flattened vineyards and ruined farmhouses. The convoy had pulled onto a wide dirt shoulder. Boots crunched on gravel. The voices of the American drivers drifted back, deep, rhythmic, shouting to one another in a slang-heavy English she could barely parse. She tensed, expecting the canvas to be ripped open, expecting violence. Instead, a canteen was thrust through the gap in the flap. "Water," a voice said from outside. Not a command, just a statement. Hildegard stared at the aluminum flask dangling in the opening. A dark hand held it. The fingers were calloused, the nails trimmed short and clean. No one moved to take it. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind, images of jazz-crazed demons. "Take it," Hildegard whispered to the woman nearest the flap. "It might be poison." Muller whimpered. "If they wanted to kill us, they would use bullets." "It is cheaper," Hildegard said pragmatically. She reached over, took the canteen, and unscrewed the cap. She took a small sip first. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was sweet relief. She passed it to Greta. The truck engine roared back to life, cutting short the brief respite. The canteen was snatched back, the flap fell shut, and they were moving again. But the dynamic in the dark truck bed had shifted. The water hadn't been poison. Night fell, turning the interior into a pitch-black tomb. Hours later, the motion changed. The bouncing stopped, replaced by the smooth hum of asphalt, then the slow crunch of gravel. Lights harsh, electric floodlights cut through the canvas gaps, slicing across the women's faces. The truck stopped for good. The engine died. "Everybody out," a voice boomed. Hildegard stood up on stiff legs, helping Greta to her feet. She patted her pocket one last time, ensuring the Riff soap was safe. She stepped toward the tailgate, blinking as the canvas was thrown back. They had arrived at the wire. The air here was different, saltier, warmer. They were near the sea. Pisa. As Hildegard jumped down from the truck, her boots sinking into the dust, she looked up. Towering above them, illuminated by the searchlights, were the guard towers, and patrolling the perimeter, walking with a casual but imposing gait, were the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division. Dozens of them. The rumors were true. They had been delivered into the hands of the other. The floodlights buzzed like angry hornets, casting pools of stark, white illumination against the velvet darkness of the Tuscan night. The women huddled together in the center of the intake yard, a shivering mass of field gray and terrified silence. Hildegard stood at the perimeter of the group, her back to Greta, facing the unknown. Every muscle in her body was coiled, prepared to fight. Though she had no weapon but her fingernails and the block of gritty Riff soap weighing down her pocket. Around them, the camp operated with a terrifying efficiency. This was not the chaotic slaughterhouse the radio broadcasts had promised. It was a machine. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division moved through the light and shadow with a fluidity that unsettled her. They were big men, taller and broader than the starved conscripts she was used to seeing in the Wehrmacht during the final months. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots polished to a dull shine that reflected the overhead arcs. But it was their faces that drew her gaze. Despite her fear. "Don't look at them," Frau Muller whispered behind her, her voice trembling. "If you look at them, they take it as a challenge." Hildegard ignored her. She couldn't look away. She watched a pair of MPs patrolling the fence line. They carried M1 carbines slung casually over their shoulders, barrels pointing at the ground, not at the women. They were talking to each other, low and easy, their laughter rolling out in deep, resonant waves that sounded nothing like the shrieking hysteria of German propaganda. A whistle blew, sharp and piercing. The group of women flinched as one organism. A soldier detached himself from the shadows of the guard shack and walked toward them. He was an immense figure, his helmet netting casting a checkered shadow over his face. On his sleeve, the chevron of a staff sergeant was clearly visible, along with a circular patch featuring a buffalo. Hildegard's heart hammered against her ribs. This is it, she thought. The selection. The violation. She stepped back, pushing Greta deeper into the cluster of women, shielding the girl with her own body. She clenched her hand inside her pocket, the sharp corner of the Riff soap digging into her palm until it hurt. The pain was grounding. I am here. I am real. I will not break. The sergeant stopped 10 feet away. He didn't scream. He didn't brandish a whip. He held a clipboard. He looked over the group, his eyes moving slowly from face to face. In the harsh light, his skin was the color of deep mahogany, shining slightly with sweat. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not hungry, just tired. He looked like a man who had been on his feet for too many hours. "All right, listen up," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, rolling like thunder but lacking the lightning strike. He spoke in English, then paused, looking for a translator. When none stepped forward, he resorted to the universal language of the military, gestures. He pointed a gloved hand toward a row of canvas tents, set up in precise lines on the far side of the enclosure. "Tents," he said, enunciating clearly. He pointed to the women, then to the tents. "Sleep, now." Hildegard blinked. The command was simple. Too simple. Where was the interrogation? Where was the cruelty? A young auxiliary near the front, panicked by his proximity, stumbled and fell to her knees, sobbing loudly. "Please, no, please." The sergeant sighed. It was a sound of profound exasperation. He took a step forward. Hildegard tensed, ready to lunge. But the man didn't reach for his gun. He reached out a hand, palm up, toward the fallen girl. It was an instinctive gesture of assistance, one human reaching for another. The girl scrambled back, screaming as if he were burning her. The sergeant froze. He looked at his own hand, then at the terrified girl. A flicker of something passed across his face, not rage, but a weary hurt. He slowly lowered his hand. "Nobody's gonna touch you," he muttered, more to himself than to them. Restoring the distance. He waved his arm again toward the tents, sharper this time. "Go. Move." Hildegard let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She grabbed Greta's arm. "Walk," Hildegard commanded in a whisper. "Do exactly as he says. Just walk." As they filed past him, Hildegard risked a glance up. The sergeant was watching them go, his face impassive again. A sentinel in the dark. He wasn't the monster from the posters. He was something more confusing. A man doing a job he didn't seem to like very much. Morning broke over the camp, not with the sound of bugles, but with a smell. It was a rich, oily aroma that drifted across the barbed wire, thick enough to taste. Coffee. Real bean coffee, not the roasted acorn sludge they had been drinking in Germany for years. Following it came the scent of frying bacon, a smell so decadent it made Hildegard's empty stomach cramp violently. Inside the canvas tent, the heat was already building. 12 women lay on cots, staring up at the yellowed ceiling. They were prisoners, stripped of rank and purpose, but Hildegard refused to let them dissolve. "Up," she commanded, swinging her legs off the cot. Bedding folded. Uniforms brushed. "We will not look like refugees." Greta moved sluggishly, her eyes hollow. The terror of the previous night had faded into a dull, aching hunger. "What is the point, Hildegard?" she asked, smoothing her skirt. "Discipline is the only thing we own," Hildegard replied sharply. She checked her pocket automatically. The Riff soap was there, a hard lump against her hip. They filed out for roll call. The camp was a hive of activity. On the other side of the double fence, the soldiers of the 92nd were going about their morning routine. Hildegard watched them with narrowed eyes, looking for the cracks in their armor, the savagery she had been promised. Instead, she saw abundance. The American soldiers sat on crates, eating from tin mess kits that overflowed with white bread and eggs. They laughed loudly, their voices carrying easily in the morning air. One soldier, a young private with a cap tilted back on his head, was cleaning his rifle while smoking a cigarette. The smoke drifted toward the women, a sweet, Virginia tobacco scent that was intoxicating compared to the harsh German weeds. The young soldier noticed Greta staring at him. He didn't sneer. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in a dark face, and reached into his pocket. "Hey," he called out. He waved a hand. "Catch." An object arced over the wire fence and landed in the dust near Greta's feet. It was a chocolate bar, wrapped in silver foil and brown paper. A Hershey's bar. The silence in the German ranks was absolute. To these women, chocolate was a myth, a memory from before the bombs fell. Greta's hand twitched. She looked at the bar, then at the soldier, then back at the bar. The hunger in her eyes was primal. She took a step forward, her hand reaching down. "Do not touch it." Hildegard's voice cracked like a whip. Greta froze, her fingers inches from the foil. "But it's food." "It is bait," Hildegard hissed, stepping between the girl and the fence. She glared at the American soldier, who looked confused, his hand half raised in a wave. "They want to see us scramble for it like dogs, or perhaps it is laced with something to make us sick. Do you think they feed the enemy out of kindness?" He smiled at me, Greta whispered, a tear tracing a line through the dust on her cheek. "The wolf smiles before he bites," Hildegard said. She stooped down, picked up the chocolate bar. It felt heavy, substantial. Through the wrapper, she could feel the squares. It would be enough calories to sustain them for a day. Her own mouth watered, a physiological betrayal of her ideology. With a rigid motion, she threw the bar hard, away from the group, toward the latrine ditches. The young American soldier stopped smiling. He shook his head slowly, looking more disappointed than angry, and turned back to his breakfast. "Form up," Hildegard ordered, her voice trembling slightly. "Eyes front." Greta sobbed quietly, mourning the lost chocolate as if it were a dead relative. Hildegard stood rigid, staring straight ahead, trying to ignore the scent of bacon and the gnawing feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. By the third day, the dust of the camp had worked its way into every pore. It was a fine, gray powder that clung to skin and turned uniforms stiff. For Hildegard, this filth was more demoralizing than the hunger. To be dirty was to be defeated. She stood at the communal water trough, a long, galvanized metal basin, fed by a sputtering pipe. It was the only place in the women's sector to wash. Around her, other prisoners splashed water on their faces or scrubbed at stains on their skirts with desperate, repetitive motions. Hildegard rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that were becoming thin and wiry. She pulled the block of Riff soap from her pocket. It was smaller now, a gray, stone-like lump stamped with a code number instead of a brand name. It contained almost no fat. It was mostly clay and sand, designed to scrape dirt away rather than lift it. She dipped the uniform jacket into the cold water and began to scrub. The soap rasped against the fabric like sandpaper. There was no lather, only a gritty, gray slime. She scrubbed harder, her knuckles grazing the washboard ridges of the trough, skin breaking and bleeding into the water. She bit her lip, refusing to stop. "Cleanliness is order," she recited inwardly. "Order is survival." A shadow fell across the water. Hildegard froze, her hands submerged. She looked up slowly. Standing on the other side of the low wire fence that separated the washing area from the guard path was the staff sergeant, the large man from the first night. Washington. He wasn't patrolling. He was standing still, watching her. In his hands, he held a helmet filled with warm water and a shaving brush. He was preparing to shave. Hildegard stiffened, pulling her jacket close to her chest as a shield. She waited for the jeer, the comment, the unwanted advance. Washington looked at her hands, red and raw from the abrasive clay soap. Then, he looked at the gray lump of riff sitting on the edge of the trough. He frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He set his helmet down on a fence post. He reached into the pocket of his olive-drab trousers and pulled out a small, rectangular package wrapped in white paper with blue lettering. He peeled back the paper, revealing a bar of creamy, white soap. It was smooth, perfectly rectangular. And even from 3 feet away, the scent hit Hildegard like a physical blow. It didn't smell like chemicals or clay. It smelled of flowers, of milk, of a world where factories made things to comfort the body, not just to scour it. Washington held the bar out over the wire. "Here," he said softly. Hildegard stared at it. I have soap," she stammered, in broken English, pointing to her gray rock. "That ain't soap, ma'am. That's a brick," Washington said. He didn't smile, but his eyes were gentle. "Go on. Take it. I got plenty." Hildegard looked around. No other guards were watching. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to throw it back as she had done with the chocolate. But her hands were bleeding. The smell of the white soap was hypnotic. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his rough, warm palm as she took the bar. The contact lasted less than a second, but the shock of it vibrated up her arm. She pulled the bar back to her chest. It was heavy, dense with fat and oil. The wrapper said ivory. "Thank you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could check them. Washington nodded once, picked up his helmet, and turned to walk away, giving her privacy. Hildegard stood alone by the trough. She wet the ivory soap and rubbed it between her hands. Instantly, a thick, rich lather bloomed white bubbles, soft as clouds, covering her battered skin. She brought her hands to her face and inhaled. The scent was pure, overwhelming in its cleanliness. She washed her face, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was scraping away her skin. She felt like she was being restored. As she rinsed the foam away, the water running clear and sweet, the image of the savage receded, replaced by the memory of a man who knew the value of being clean. The midday sun over Pisa was a physical weight, baking the camp into a stupor. The air shimmered above the corrugated tin roofs of the supply depots. Hildegard sat in the shade of the tent flap, mending a tear in Greta's skirt with a needle she had fashioned from a piece of wire. The ivory soap was tucked safely in her kit, its scent a lingering ghost on her fingertips. The rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel broke the lethargy. A Willys Jeep sped toward the main gate, kicking up a cloud of dust that coated the nearby laundry lines. It screeched to a halt near the guard shack where Sergeant Washington was overseeing a work detail. A white officer stepped out. He was young, a captain, with a uniform that looked like it had never touched the mud of a battlefield. His face was flushed, perhaps from the heat, perhaps from a temper that sat too close to the surface. Hildegard stopped sewing. The entire women's section went quiet. They watched, expecting to see the camaraderie of victors. Instead, they saw a interrogation. The captain pointed a riding crop at a section of the perimeter fence where a post was leaning slightly. He shouted something Hildegard couldn't hear clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sharp, barking cadence of a master addressing a servant. Washington snapped to attention. He towered over the white officer, his shoulders broad and capable. Yet he shrank himself, tucking his chin, keeping his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "I told you people to get this squared away yesterday." The captain's voice carried now, shrill and cutting. "Do I have to do everything myself? Is that it?" "No, sir," Washington replied, his voice flat, drained of the rich baritone warmth Hildegard had heard before. "We were waiting on supplies, sir." "Don't give me excuses, Sergeant," the captain sneered. He stepped closer, invading Washington's personal space. "You get your boys moving, or I'll find someone who can follow simple instructions. Do you understand me?" "Boy?" "Boy." Hildegard knew enough English to understand the word. She looked at the graying hair at Washington's temples, the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He was a man who had crossed an ocean to fight, who commanded men, who had shown her more mercy in 3 days than the Reich had shown in 3 years. And this child officer called him boy. Washington's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. For a second, the violence that Hildegard had originally feared seemed about to erupt. She held her breath, waiting for him to strike the officer. "Yes, sir," Washington said. The captain stared at him for a moment longer, savoring the dominance. Then turned on his heel, climbed back into the jeep, and sped off, leaving a fresh layer of dust on Washington's boots. Silence returned to the camp. But it was heavy now. The other black soldiers in the detail didn't look at each other. They picked up their shovels and hammers, their movements slow, burdened by a collective shame. Washington stood alone by the leaning post. He took off his helmet and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked tired, not physically, but spiritually. Slowly, he turned toward the prisoner enclosure. He must have felt eyes on him. He looked straight at Hildegard. For the first time, she didn't see a conqueror. She saw a man who was trapped in a different kind of wire. In Germany, they had been told that these men were lower than animals. But watching the white officer, Hildegard realized that cruelty was not a matter of race. It was a matter of power. She didn't look away. She didn't glare. Slowly, deliberately, Hildegard nodded to him. It was a small, almost imperceptible dip of the chin, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another. Washington paused. His eyes widened slightly. He held her gaze for a beat, a silent acknowledgement passing between the prisoner and the jailer. Then, he put his helmet back on, adjusted the strap, and turned back to his work. Sunday arrived without bells. In the villages of Bavaria, the church bells would be ringing across the valleys now, calling the faithful to Mass. Here, on the dusty plains of Tuscany, the only tolling came from the rhythmic clang of a metal spoon against a railing, the signal for the evening count. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. Inside the wire perimeter, Hildegard gathered the women in the open space between the tents. They formed a ragged circle, heads bowed, hands clasped together. "We have no pastor," Hildegard said quietly, her voice steady despite the fatigue gnawing at her bones. "But we do not need a building to speak to God. Vater unser, I am Himmel. Geheiligt werde dein Name," the women murmured in response. But the prayer felt thin. It lacked the weight of conviction. Greta, standing beside Hildegard, was trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The despair in the camp was a physical thing, a heaviness that pressed down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. They were far from home, defeated, and surrounded by men they still barely understood. As they reached the middle of the prayer, a sound drifted across the perimeter. It wasn't the sharp bark of orders, or the mechanical growl of trucks. It was a low, resonant hum. It started with one voice, deep, rich, and mournful, and then another joined in, adding a layer of harmony that vibrated through the cooling air. Hildegard stopped praying. She opened her eyes. Around the circle, other women lifted their heads, confusion replacing their piety. "What is that?" Greta whispered. "Is it a funeral?" Hildegard turned toward the guard post. A group of 5 soldiers from the 92nd, including Sergeant Washington, were sitting on upturned crates near a small fire they had kindled. They weren't looking at the prisoners. They were looking into the fire, their postures relaxed but somber. The humming swelled into words. It wasn't the frenetic jazz that Goebbels had warned them about. It was slow. It was heavy with a sorrow that seemed old as the earth itself. "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." The melody was simple, sliding between notes in a way European hymns never did. It was a sound born of suffering, of chains, of a longing for a home that could not be reached. Hildegard stood transfixed. She didn't understand all the lyrics, but she understood the feeling. It was the same feeling that sat in her own chest. The loss, the displacement, the weary hope for a better world. Washington's voice rose above the others, a powerful baritone that carried effortlessly over the barbed wire. He wasn't singing to entertain. He was singing to survive the silence. Slowly, without a command from Hildegard, the women began to pray again. But this time, the rhythm changed. They unconsciously slowed their recitation of the Lord's Prayer to match the cadence of the soldiers' song. Vergib uns unsere Schuld. Forgive us our trespasses. Glory, hallelujah. The German words and the American melody wove together in the twilight. The barbed wire, usually a symbol of division, seemed to dissolve, leaving only 2 groups of tired human beings under the same indifferent sky. Greta began to cry, but she kept praying. Tears streamed down Hildegard's face, washing away the dust. She didn't wipe them away. She gripped the ivory soap in her pocket, feeling its smooth surface, and listened to the savages sing about Jesus with more soul than she had heard in any cathedral in Berlin. For 10 minutes, there was no war. There was only the voice of the enemy, carrying the weight of their shared sorrow up toward the heavens. When the song ended, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The heat broke 2 days later, not with a whisper, but with a scream. It started in the late afternoon, the sky turning a bruised shade of violet over the Apennine Mountains. The air grew heavy, charged with static that made the hair on Hildegard's arms stand up. Then, the wind hit a sudden, violent gale that swept down from the hills, picking up dust, debris, and loose equipment. "Secure the flaps," Hildegard shouted, her voice barely audible over the rising howl. The first drops of rain felt like gravel being thrown against the canvas. Within seconds, the heavens opened. It was a torrential downpour, a solid sheet of water that turned the dusty camp into a quagmire instantly. The women scrambled inside the tents, but the wind was relentless. It tore at the canvas, snapping the tie-downs. The tent poles groaned under the strain. Hold it down," Greta screamed, grabbing a corner of the billowing fabric. Hildegard threw her weight against the center pole, which was vibrating violently. Outside, a tent peg ripped free from the softening earth with a wet pop. The corner of the tent collapsed, allowing the rain to lash inside, soaking the bedding and the women. Panic erupted. If the tents went down, they would be exposed to the elements, wet, shivering, and vulnerable in the mud. Suddenly, through the curtain of rain, dark shapes appeared at the perimeter. They were running. Hildegard's stomach dropped. They are coming in. The storm provided the perfect cover for chaos, for the violation she had feared since the beginning. She braced herself against the pole, looking around for a weapon, finding nothing but the wet canvas. The figures burst through the gate of the women's enclosure. It was Sergeant Washington and half a dozen of his men. They wore ponchos that flapped like bat wings in the gale. Their heads bowed against the wind. They carried sledgehammers and coils of rope. They didn't look at the women. They looked at the tents. "Grab that line!" Washington roared, his voice cutting through the storm. A soldier threw himself onto the loose guy line that Greta was struggled to hold. He didn't push her aside. He simply added his weight, his boots sinking deep into the mud to find traction. With a grunt of exertion, he hauled the rope tight, pulling the canvas back into shape. Washington moved to the corner where the peg had failed. He didn't ask permission. He dropped to his knees in the mud. Right beside Hildegard, he swung a heavy mallet, driving a new, longer iron stake deep into the ground with 3 powerful strikes. Hildegard stared down at him. Rainwater streamed off his helmet, running in rivets down his face. He was inches away from her. She could smell the wet wool of his uniform and the faint, clean scent of ivory soap. He looked up, wiping mud from his eyes. "You okay in there, ma'am?" he shouted. He wasn't an invader. He was a wall. He was using the very strength she had been taught to fear the physical power of the primitive to shelter them. "Yes," Hildegard shouted back, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "We are holding." Washington nodded and scrambled up. He moved to the next tent, barking orders to his men. "Tighten them all up. Check the rear stakes. Let's go. Let's go." For 20 minutes, the soldiers fought the storm alongside the prisoners. They hammered, pulled, and braced, their bodies acting as anchors against the wind. There were no slurs, no leering looks. There was only the universal, frantic brotherhood of humans fighting nature. As quickly as it had arrived, the wind died down, leaving only a steady, soaking rain. The soldiers stood back, panting, their uniforms dark with water and caked with mud. The tents stood firm. Washington took a moment to catch his breath. He looked at the row of secured tents, then at Hildegard, who was standing in the entrance of her shelter, soaked to the bone but safe. He touched the brim of his helmet, a small, polite gesture. "Storm's passing," he said simply. "You ladies stay dry." He turned and led his men back out of the enclosure, closing the wire gate behind them. Hildegard watched them go. She reached into her wet pocket and touched the smooth surface of the American soap. The fear was gone. It had been washed away by the rain and the realization that these men had just saved them. The orders came 2 days after the storm, delivered on a clipboard by a white lieutenant who didn't look up from his paperwork. "Transport at 0800, he barked. "Work, release program. Northern sector. Work, release program." The camp dissolved into a frantic, hushed activity. This time, however, the panic was different. When they had arrived, they were terrified of where they were going because of who guarded it. Now, they were terrified to leave. Hildegard folded her blanket with military precision, smoothing out the wrinkles. Beside her, Greta was sniffing back tears. "Do you think the next guards will be like them?" Greta asked, gesturing vaguely toward the perimeter where the soldiers of the 92nd were rolling up wire and dismantling the storm-damaged sections. "I do not know," Hildegard said. She packed her few possessions, a comb, a spare pair of socks, and the bar of ivory soap. It was worn down now, the sharp edges smoothed into a comfortable oval that fit perfectly in her palm. It smelled of safety. She reached into the bottom of her pocket and pulled out the Riff soap. The gray, gritty block was dry and cracking, like a piece of old slate. It felt heavy, burdened with the memory of the retreat, the burning documents, and the lies of the propaganda ministry. Hildegard looked at the Riff soap, then at the wooden crate that had served as her bedside table. With a deliberate movement, she set the gray block down on the crate. She would not take it with her. She was leaving the grit behind. "Trucks!" Muller called out from the tent flap. The familiar roar of the deuce and a halfs filled the air. The women filed out, carrying their bundles. The morning light was harsh, exposing the mud left by the storm. Sergeant Washington stood by the open gate of the loading area. He held the manifest, checking names as the women climbed onto the truck beds. He wasn't smiling, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. He looked like a man saying goodbye to neighbors, not prisoners. When Hildegard reached the front of the line, she stopped. The engine idled loudly, vibrating through the soles of her boots. She looked up at him. Up close, she saw the gray stubble on his chin, the fatigue that never seemed to leave his eyes. He checked her name off the list. Hildegard, he read aloud. It was the first time he had used her name. He didn't butcher the pronunciation. He said it with a quiet respect. Sergeant, she replied in English. She wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him that he had destroyed the world she knew. Not with a gun, but with a bar of soap and a gospel song. She wanted to warn him about the white captain, to tell him to be careful. But the gap between them, language, rank, history, was still too wide to bridge with words. Instead, she shifted her bundle, ensuring the ivory soap was secure. She looked him in the eye, straight and unflinching, and nodded. A slow, deep nod of recognition. Washington returned the nod. He touched the brim of his helmet. "Good luck, ma'am," he said. "You take care now." "You too," she whispered. She climbed into the truck. The canvas flap was lowered, sealing them in semi-darkness once again. But the air inside didn't smell of fear anymore. It smelled of damp wool and the faint, sweet scent of American cleanliness. As the convoy lurched forward, grinding gears as it pulled away from the camp near Pisa, Greta leaned against Hildegard. "I will miss them," the young girl admitted softly. Hildegard closed her eyes, visualizing the gray block of Riff soap sitting alone on the crate, abandoned in the empty tent. "Yes," Hildegard said. "They were good men." The truck picked up speed, carrying them away from the anomaly of the last week, back into a Europe that was still broken. But perhaps, for Hildegard, slightly less dark. Cologne, Germany, November 1948. The war had been over for 3 years, but the city still wore its skeleton on the outside. Cologne was a jagged landscape of hollowed-out facades and mountains of brick, where women in headscarves, the Trümmerfrauen, formed human chains to pass buckets of debris, stone by stone, clearing the way for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Hildegard wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. The dust here was different from the dust in Italy. It tasted of pulverized mortar and old fires. She walked home through the darkening streets, her boots crunching on the gravel. Home was a cellar apartment in a building that had lost its top 3 floors. It was damp and cramped, shared with her sister's family, but it was theirs. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of potato soup. Her niece, a 7-year-old girl named Clara, was sitting at the wooden table, staring at a newspaper that had been used to wrap vegetables. "Auntie Hildegard?" Clara asked, pointing to a grainy photograph in the paper. It showed American soldiers handing out supplies in Berlin. "Is it true what the boys at school say? That the black soldiers? That they eat children?" Hildegard froze. She was unbuttoning her coat, but her hands stopped midway. The propaganda of the Reich had deep roots. It lingered like the smell of smoke in the ruins, poisoning the minds of children who hadn't even seen the fighting. Her sister, stirring the soup, looked over nervously. "Clara, hush. Don't ask such things." Hildegard walked to the small sink in the corner. Sitting on the porcelain rim was a bar of soap. It was a new ration, part of the relief aid flooding into the western zones. It was white. It was wrapped in paper that looked vaguely familiar. She picked it up. She brought it to her nose and inhaled. Instantly, the damp cellar of Cologne vanished. The smell of milk and mild flowers transported her back to the sun-baked heat of Pisa. She felt the ghost of a warm breeze, heard the deep, sorrowful hum of a gospel song drifting over barbed wire, and saw the tired, kind eyes of a man who had held power but chose mercy. "No, Clara," Hildegard said. Her voice was firm, cutting through the bubbling of the soup pot. She turned to face her niece. She walked to the table and sat down, placing the bar of soap in the center of the wood, like a centerpiece. "That is a lie," Hildegard said. "A lie told by bad men who wanted us to be afraid." Clara looked up, eyes wide. "But did you see them? The Schwarze?" "I did," Hildegard nodded. "I was their prisoner. I was frightened, just like you. I had a piece of stone that I called soap, and it made my hands bleed. And then," she touched the white bar on the table, "then a man named Washington gave me this. He was a soldier. He was a giant, and he had every reason to hate us. But when the storm came, he held up our roof. When we were hungry, he fed us. When we were dirty, he gave us dignity." The room was silent. Her sister had stopped stirring the soup. "They are not monsters, Clara," Hildegard said softly, her eyes misty not with sadness, but with a fierce gratitude. "They were the first people who treated me like a human being when the whole world wanted us dead." Clara reached out and touched the soap, her small finger tracing the letters stamped into the surface. Hildegard looked at the soap, then at the ruins outside the narrow window. The city would be rebuilt. The buildings would rise again. But the most important reconstruction had already happened inside her. She had learned to see with her own eyes, not the eyes of the enemy. "Wash your hands for dinner," Hildegard said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "And use the good soap."